Slathe, a Bloodhound story. The greasy gray smog of the Hive City condensed on the red and black armor of the 5 Bloodhound Space Marines. The alleys they walked through were narrow and claustrophobic, making them walk through them single file. "This gunk's getting everywhere," noted one of the Marines. "I can't see a thing," he said, wiping at his helmet's lens. "Switch to thermal optics," ordered the corporal. The Marine tapped his helmet, cycling through the different optic choices it supplied. "Any response from Sergeant Tegius?" the corporal asked, as he signaled the combat squad to hold position before moving on into the open street ahead of them. The 5 Marines all took a knee. The Marine at the back of the line activated the inbuilt Vox within his helmet. "Sergeant Tegius," the Marine said over the Vox. "Sergeant Tegius, do you copy?" The Marine deactivated the Vox and looked to the corporal. "Nothing. He's not responding." "Then for all we know, the sergeant and the rest of our brothers are dead," the corporal said, pulling a second bolt pistol out from the second holster at his waist. "It could be interference from the structure," suggested the Marine directly behind the corporal. "Let's keep moving," the corporal ordered, with a wave from one of the bolt pistols, and the Bloodhounds advanced. The heavy metal greaves of the Space Marines clanged loudly against the grated metal floors. Every weighted step they took echoed off into the depths of the hive spire. They spread out on the street, looking down the subsequent alleys for any sign of the creature they were tracking. "Boreanaz," the corporal said. "You scout ahead through here," he said, pointing down one of the alleys. "We'll rendezvous with you shortly." "Aye," one of the Marines shouted before jogging down the alleyway alone. "Terathor." "Anything on the Vox?" the corporal asked as he looked to the alley where Terathor was standing, but was there no longer. "Terathor," he shouted, walking toward the alley. "Terathor, report." "Perhaps the interference is stronger than before," one of the Marines said. "Perhaps. But he shouldn't have backtracked without mentioning it to me. Marines, fall in," the corporal shouted. The pair of Marines that remained quickly grouped together with the corporal. "Boreanaz, report," the corporal ordered over the Vox. "Boreanaz here, brother, just passing the 3rd marker." "Very good, Boreanaz. Hold position there. We have lost contact with Terathor and are beginning our sweep. Stay vigilant." The corporal deactivated his Vox and began to walk down the wide and open street. The 3 Marines crept cautiously through the streetway. Water from many floors above them dripped down between the cracks and grated floors of the poorly lit Hive City onto the grease-stained armor of the Bloodhounds, diluting the oily layer building up on them. 2 of the Marines were equipped with bolt guns with searchlights attached. The powerful bright light from the bulbs pierced the shadows of the alleys, exposing anything in its light path. The 2 Marines walked behind the corporal, who remained at point. "Something bothering you?" one Marine asked the other. "That Vox transmission," he responded. The corporal was able to contact Boreanaz, but not Terathor, he continued. "Yes? So?" The corporal ordered Boreanaz to scout ahead just before Terathor went missing. "So? So what?" the Marine asked the other. The corporal stopped, interrupting the two Marines' conversation. "That means that Terathor couldn't be any further away than Boreanaz," the corporal stated, before reactivating his helmet Vox. "Boreanaz," the corporal said over the Vox. "Yes, Corporal," Boreanaz replied. "Marine, approximate the distance you've covered from our last position." The three Marines waited in the silence for a moment. 20 meters. The corporal turned to face the Marines. "He's within 20 meters, he said, walking back down the reverse direction. "Making interference unlikely. Marines, to me," he shouted, before running back down the street toward the alley Terathor was last seen. Suddenly, a tumbling mess of red and black power armor crashed down onto the floor in front of him. The corporal immediately stumbled over the body, sending him tripping to the floor, palms first. The corporal pushed himself up to his feet and turned to see what had happened. "Brother Terathor," one of the Marines asked. The corporal turned over the blood-covered and scratch-ridden armor of his fallen brother. "No, Sergeant Tegius," the corporal answered, with a tone of grief. "He's been bisected. No chance of recovery." The three Marines closed in together, their backs to each other, so no one or no thing could sneak up to them. Blood dripped down from the floors above the Marines, mixing into the stray pools of oily water. The Marines stepped slowly, rotating circularly as they walked. "Come out, creature," the corporal said into the shadows. "Show yourself." A brief rumbling growl echoed around them. Then something metal ricocheted down off the catwalks, railings, pipes, and any stray broken plate. The sound got louder until another mangled battle brother landed 2 meters from them. "Brother Terathor," one of the Marines shouted before bolting towards his broken comrade. "Jarrus, stop!" the corporal shouted. With an echoing snap, the Marine was lifted up into the shadows by strands of blood-soaked leather. The other Marine fired his bolt gun up into the darkness above him, each shot illuminating the shadows for a brief moment, displaying the shifting creature lurking out of sight, and their flailing brother struggling for his life. "Arator! Hold your fire!" the corporal shouted. "You might hit Jarrus! Stop!" He pushed down Arator's bolter, and Arator stopped shooting. "Corporal, I heard bolter fire. Do you need assistance?" Boreanaz asked over the Vox. "Hold position, Boreanaz. Do not engage." "Copied," Boreanaz said before closing communication. The two Marines circled back to back. The pain-filled cries of their brother Jarrus resonated through the steel labyrinth of the Hive City. A red and gold blur whizzed through one of the alleyways, catching Arator's attention. "There!" he shouted before firing his bolt gun down the alley. The corporal turned to join Arator, firing both his bolt pistols into the alley. The two Marines fired until their magazines were empty, each consecutive round leaving more damage than the last. The ceramite piping and plasteel bulkheads littered the alley, scattered throughout it like a lost herd. Some pieces dangled from the walls they were once mounted to. "Reload!" the corporal barked, while releasing his expent magazine and slamming in a fresh one to the bolt pistol's ammo feeds. Arator released the clip from his bolt gun and opened a small pouch at his waist containing 2 magazines. Before Arator could grab one of the magazines, the broken body of Jarrus was thrown against him, tossing him across the street into a ceramite wall. "Arator!" the corporal yelled as he ran to his side. The corporal pulled off the remains of Brother Jarrus, which pinned Arator. Jarrus was missing a leg, ripped from his thigh. His armor was torn, blood leaked through the cracks that traversed it. "Arator!" the corporal said to the Marine who was unconscious. A deep snarl, mixed with heavy footsteps, echoed around the corporal, each step bringing the sound closer, louder, until it brought what he was there to face. The creature, the demon, the bloodthirster. "Demon!" the corporal shouted as he charged towards the 18-foot monster, both of his bolt pistols firing into its demon skin, its wounds healing over, expelling the spent bolt rounds. The bloodthirster countercharged the corporal, launching him from the impact of one of its massive wings. He skidded when he hit the ground, stopping next to Arator's bolt gun. The corporal quickly looked over to Arator, who was regaining consciousness. The corporal picked up the bolter and attempted to fire upon the approaching demon. 3 hollow clicks came from the bolter as the corporal pulled its trigger. "Arator! Toss me your ammo!" the corporal ordered. Arator quickly unfastened the pouch containing the magazines from his waist and held it in the air for the marshal. He held it in the air for the corporal. The corporal reached towards Arator with a horrifying screech. The bloodthirster slammed its axe down onto Arator, crushing as well as slicing through the armor of the downed Marine. Blood shot in all directions as it was squeezed out of Arator's broken power armor, squirting out from his open wounds and from the cracks in his armor, searching for new ways to escape the rapidly filling armor. The corporal worked his way up to his feet, still gripping the unloaded bolt gun. "I am a chosen warrior of the Emperor," he said, as he walked toward the massive demon. "I am a servant of Arrow. Fierceness is my weapon," he continued to chant. The bloodthirster lifted its axe from the sticky viscera surrounding it, kicking over the corpses of the Bloodhound Space Marines. "Zeal is in every round." The bloodthirster turned to the Marine approaching it. "My duty is my devotion," he said, now facing off with his foe. "I praise the Emperor," he yelled, as he began to run toward the demon, raising the unloaded bolter above his head. "And all in him through Arrow I serve," he shouted, as he brought the bolter down upon the knee of the demon, bashing and butting it with as much strength as he could. The bloodthirster swung its massive right arm, smashing its backhand against the corporal, launching him into the ceramite wall behind him. The impact indented him into the wall. Warning lights and buzzers activated within his helmet. A schematic of his armor was laid out on the bottom right of his helmet's visual display. A percentage was next to each section of the armor schematic. Many of the sections were listed in the high 80s. Several others had exceeded the limit. The corresponding part shown on the schematic was darkened. Power armor exceeding pressure threshold. An automated voice within his helmet stated. "Remain vigilant," it said to the deafened ears of the barely conscious marshal. The demon took giant strides, closing the distance very quickly. The corporal fumbled at the pouch at his waist. He pulled a single crack grenade out, holding it in his left hand, staring at it with his head cocked. "I know no fear," he muttered, before reaching for the grenade's release with his right hand. In that brief instant, the massive hand of the bloodthirster shot down, snatching the corporal's left wrist, lifting him up 12 feet in the air. The corporal screamed in agony as the bloodthirster held him in the air. "This world and millions more will collapse and fall into chaos," the creature said in its deep, menacing voice. "Wrong, demon!" the corporal shouted. The bloodthirster crushed the corporal's wrist, its massive head looming in on the wincing marine. "Why are you so sure?" it asked before roaring, as bolter fire penetrated its back. The bloodthirster dropped the corporal and turned around. Its massive body quickly turned before the corporal hit the grated metal floor. "Because the Emperor ordains it so," Boreanaz shouted from 2 blocks away down the Hive City street. Boreanaz fired his bolter again into the gigantic demon. The bloodthirster screeched and roared as the rocket-propelled bolt rounds found new homes in its demon skin. The bloodthirster raised its massive clawed hands to protect its face as it walked toward the last standing marine. The corporal managed to lift himself to one knee. The schematic of his armor was darkened in several more locations. The image of a skull and crossbones appeared over his left wrist. His arm was broken in several places. The corporal activated his vox on the side of his helmet. "Boreanaz, what are you doing?" he asked, watching the demon walk closer to the marine. Boreanaz quickly fell back into a stairwell behind him, firing his bolter in his right hand as he entered the ceramite-surrounded entrance. The bloodthirster began to run toward Boreanaz. It scooped up a garbage dumpster with one swift swoop of its arm, and tossed it with speed and accuracy into the stairwell, lodging itself into the entrance. The corporal crawled into the nearby alley, positioning himself into cover behind crates. He could hear the blood-curdling roar of the demon behind him in the streets. "Boreanaz reporting," the Marine said over the vox. "I came to spread the glory of the Emperor, and I will not allow my fallen brothers to go unavenged." The corporal peeked his head around the side of the crates he used to remain unseen. The bloodthirster paced around the open street, staring through the grated floor, searching for Boreanaz, as he stealthed through the corridors and alleyways of the level beneath them. The corporal pulled his head back. "What good is glory, Boreanaz, if you get yourself killed?" The corporal waited for a moment before walking, looking out from behind the boxes. The bloodthirster had walked away out of sight. The corporal crawled through the alleyway until he reached a column of pillars, which he stood behind, He could make out a brief glimpse of the blood-red demon's skin and fleshy wings between the pillars. "We spread his glory because we are the Emperor's chosen. These worlds his realm." The corporal could hear Boreanaz's voice coming from his vox and from elsewhere. The corporal deactivated his vox, and using his lineman's ear, filtered out the noises around him to hear Boreanaz and locate him. The thunderous crack of a bolt gun firing in the street echoed through the narrow passages. The corporal peeked out from the pillar he stood behind. Boreanaz walked towards the bloodthirster, bolt gun raised in his right hand. The bloodthirster walked into the corporal's view. "It is the Emperor's glory, and it is our duty to protect it," Boreanaz shouted, before charging the demon. Boreanaz's bolter fired as he ran, each bolt round one step closer to achieving their mission. The bloodthirster swung its hand down onto the Marine, incapacitating him with one powerful hand chop to the collar and left shoulder. The bloodthirster lifted Boreanaz to his knees by his helmet and readied its massive cornate axe for the final blow. A powerful presence entered the Hive City street. A psychic hum resonated from the walls of the structuring around them. The bloodthirster raised its axe high above its head, then swung down with a force unimaginable by mortal men, but was suddenly stricken paralyzed, as a voice from the opposite side of the long street echoed through the area, an equally powerful force pushing the voice forward, carrying a single word. "Enough!" The bloodthirster looked up the road. The corporal looked over as well. Standing in the street was the librarian, Leo. His long brown hair flowed freely from his head. The hazel of his eyes was locked onto the demon. In his gauntlets, he carried a plasma pistol and his trusted ancient force axe, modified from its original use as a power axe. The bloodthirster grinned before looking back down to Boreanaz, raising its axe-wielding arm once again. Leo raised his palm toward the bloodthirster, gripping his force axe with his thumb. An imprint the size of a man's head indented into the ribs of the demon. The bloodthirster screeched again in fury and pain. Staring the librarian in the eyes, it snapped Boreanaz's neck with a single jerk from its wrist. With a roar, the bloodthirster flew into the air, its wings spreading to both sides of the road. The claustrophobic space of the Hive City slowed the creature down, forcing it to evade the surroundings and be much more precise with its flight. Landing feet from the librarian, the demon howled out a horrific battle cry, flailing its arms as it kicked on the spot. The demon only stopped its tirade to see the librarian's reaction. The demon loomed down towards Leo, snarling as its eyes locked on to the calm and collected Space Marine. In a fit of fury, the bloodthirster raised its axe and swung down. The axe slammed into the floor beside Leo, missing him by inches. The demon loomed its head back down to the librarian, their faces nearly as close as the axe was from Leo. "Are you afraid, psyker?" the demon asked with a growl in its voice. "Your fate will be worse than those of your brothers, psyker. When I have finished bathing in your blood, I will enjoy drinking in your essence." The bloodthirster screamed as it lifted its axe once more into the air. The librarian fired his plasma pistol into the demon's left knee. A shot of light blue burned its way into the demon's skin, dropping the bloodthirster to one knee. The demon screeched in agony as it raised its axe again. The librarian quickly fired at the axe, the plasma supercharging the axe with the heat, the force of the impact launching the axe from its hand to the ground behind it. The demon leaned forward on its hands, its face leaning in close to Leo. The bloodthirster screeched and was about to leap towards the librarian. But before it could, the librarian slammed his force axe into the forehead of the demon. Crackling psychic energy swirled around the axe and from the wound. All thought was being drained from the demon as it passed from the weapon to the air. The psychic energy ignited into white psionic fire. The demon, in one last great roar, stood up, its arms flailing in all directions. One by one, each limb folded away into the demon flesh, each limb releasing a cloud of white psionic fire as it joined the floating ball of demon flesh, liquid but solid, shifting but remaining the same. The ball floated in mid-air. The demon's wings were all that remained outside the churning ball of blood-red flesh, but even they fell victim to the librarian's psionic fire. The ball burned in mid-air. Material and immaterial burned away in the fire, until all that remained was a floating ball of ash. A glyph of blood, in the insignia of Khorne, was imprinted upon the top of the ball of ash. The ball just floated for a moment, then fell apart, blowing off in the psychic winds emanating from the librarian. The marshal, the corporal, walked out from behind the pillar. "Hiding, brother?" Leo asked him. "Tactical position," the corporal said, while cradling his broken arm. "Squad status?" the librarian asked without a change of impression, without a change in expression. "All dead," the corporal answered in a solemn tone. "The target is eliminated," Leo said, clipping his axe to his waist and holstering his plasma pistol. "The mission was a success." "Success?" the corporal shouted. "Sergeant Tegius and the 8 Marines under our command are dead. How can this be called a success?" The librarian turned face and began walking away down the street. "It is better to die for the Emperor than live for yourself," he said, without looking back. The corporal followed him through the street. "How can you say that, bookkeeper? Or have the deaths of others secured your position as historian?" the corporal said, with a tone of distrust in the librarian. Leo stopped walking and turned slightly to look over his left shoulder at the corporal. "Because it is true. I know it. Your brothers knew it. Do you agree with them?" Leo then continued walking down the street. "Or do you believe in a higher purpose than our service to the Emperor?" "No," the corporal replied. "My duty is my devotion." "Good," Leo said, cutting off the corporal. "Now we will no longer speak of this. Blessed is the mind too small for doubt." The librarian and the corporal did not speak during the walk to the extraction point. The 2 Bloodhounds Marines traversed the Hive City streets, walking constantly for just under 3 hours. Finally reaching the extraction point. The extraction point was one of the Hive City's landing pads, although the design of the pad was meant for trade ships of the rogue traders, or one of the smaller crafts of the Imperial Navy, such as a Valkyrie. A Bloodhound Thunderhawk rested half its hull on the landing pad. Stabilizer thrusters on the rear of the ship kept the back half elevated in equal proportion to the resting front half. The front hatch of the Thunderhawk was open, lowered to the pad like a ramp. Light from within the Thunderhawk transport escaped from the front hatch, like water through a bursting dam. Within the center of the light was a giant silhouette, clad in armor, fit to size. Long flowing hair extended from the giant silhouette. "I trust our mission was a success?" asked the silhouette. "Your trust is well placed, Lord," Leo said, as he bowed his head, placing his right hand over the left of his chest. "Sergeant Tegius?" the silhouette asked. Leo shook his head, his answer not needing words. The giant figure stepped forward out of the light, from the Thunderhawk's interior. The corporal's helmet was cracked and broken. The optical display was damaged, creating flares in the light. The corporal removed his helmet with his right hand at his waist. The corporal removed his helmet, holding it within his right hand at his waist. The corporal's sweat and blood-soaked hair dropped down to length to his collar. The corporal's sweat and blood-soaked hair dropped down in length to his collar. His hair was gray with strands of silvery white. The greasy hair clumped around and stuck to his neck and face. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the natural light outside. His vision was blurred, but quickly corrected itself. The corporal was astonished once he had realized who the figure standing in front of him was. He was face to face with the Lord and Master of the Bloodhounds, Aero the Whirlwind. The wind from the Thunderhawk's turbines blew Aero's hair forward as he descended the ramp. He towered over the Marines as they would mortal men. The Chrysogrim, Aero's personalized sword, hung from the latch holding it to his waist. He looked down at the corporal in front of him. Leo glanced at them for an instant. "The corporal, my lord," Leo said, announcing the rank of the Marine. "A survivor," Aero said with a tone of surprise. "This is unexpected." The corporal grinned as he strode past the giant in his way. "The Emperor protects," he said, walking up the Thunderhawk ramp. "Indeed," Aero said with a smirk. Aero and Leo both entered the Thunderhawk. 4 veteran Marines from the honor guard of the Bloodhounds exit the craft, taking positions at the entrances to the ports. Aero and Leo both entered the Thunderhawk. 4 veteran Marines from the honor guard of the Bloodhounds exit the craft, taking positions at the entrances to the ports. The Thunderhawk's engines began to heat up, preparing for the return to the hourglass flagship of the Bloodhounds. The entrance ramp to the Thunderhawk raised, closing the hatch as it lifted off from the pad. The transport ship spun around, then blasted off into the upper atmosphere. The corporal laid on a stone table. Most of his armor had been removed from the waist up. Only his black carapace had remained. Scores of servitors carried the remnants of his Mark VI power armor away to the ship's armory where they could be repaired. maintained, and held until given to another Marine. "Still reckless, brother?" the apothecary examining him asked, as he reached for the corporal's left arm. "Still alive," he said, grinning. The apothecary forced the corporal's broken arm to sit, snapping the bones into place. The corporal winced as his arm cracked, his smirk wiped clean with pain. "That's odd," the apothecary noted. "What's odd? That I've regained my senses?" the corporal asked angrily. The apothecary pulled a glass vial cylinder containing a dark blue liquid from a pouch at his waist. He inserted the vial into a gun-like device with a syringe protruding from what would be equivalent to a barrel. "Out with it, old man!" the corporal barked before the apothecary spun around, placing the machine to the corporal's neck and pulling its trigger. The syringe dug into his neck, injecting the dark blue formula directly into his bloodstream. Almost immediately, the corporal felt a euphoric effect. His body relaxed. His motions slowed. The room around him blurred. The sounds in the room melded together and repeated. The corporal's wits were slowing down, but he tried to push words past his numbing lips. "Who? What did—" he said before losing balance, sliding off the stone table. The apothecary shifted the corporal back into position. "Be quiet now, brother. Your armor was damaged. Its internal mechanisms shattered." The apothecary walked away from the table and began to soak a cloth with cold water. The apothecary walked back to the corporal, dabbing the cloth at the waxy blood covering his face. He rinsed the cloth and wiped it over the marshal's broken arm. "Rest. For now you will feel no pain," the apothecary said, as the corporal slipped in and out of consciousness. Everything was dark. Everything but his hands in front of him. He looked down to see he was but a man. A man with flaws. A man with weaknesses. A man with fears. Suddenly faces once known, long lost, flew past him, and a long, unending staircase appeared before him. He climbed the steps until he reached a wooden door. Stepping through the door, he fell. He fell forever. He kept falling until the reality around him righted itself and he found himself on his feet. He wore clothes that were familiar to him, yet unknown. Suppressed. He was in a town in the sand. Standing in front of him was a golden man. He reaches to his waist for his firearms, raises them to the golden man. Pain. Faces. Flying by, much more familiar, more recent. Too quick to register, until stopping on a blood-red demon face of a bloodthirster. The corporal awoke with several servitors around him, replacing his broken armor. He looked around and noticed he was no longer in the infirmary, but he'd been moved to the armory. "How did I get here?" the corporal asked, still groggy from the anesthetic. The servitors all continued with their work, silent, unreacting to the Marine's words. "You were brought here after Generon was finished with you. said a familiar voice from 4 meters ahead of him. The corporal looked straight ahead. Sitting on a stone bench was the Lord of the Bloodhounds. Arrow. "My lord," the corporal said, with his wits coming to attention. "Have you been here the whole time? I was unconscious," he asked, confused by Arrow's presence. Arrow smiled and looked up to the corporal, through the thick veil of his hair. "Who do you think carried you here?" he asked in response. "I know many of my brother Marines. I know many of my sons, most even by name." Arrow stood from the stone slab. "But I don't know your face. I've not heard your name." The corporal stared at Arrow. "Slathe," he said silently, but loud enough for Arrow to hear. "Slathe? An odd name," Arrow said as he sat back down on the stone. "What world heralds it?" Arrow asked inquisitively. "I don't remember my world," Slathe said with a tone of regret. "It is my opinion that all men know their past," Arrow said, rising from his seat. "It's important to know where one comes from, where they've been. It tells you where one is going," he said, approaching Slathe. "I have dreams," Slathe retorted. "Dreams?" Arrow asked with a newfound interest. "Passing memories. Nothing I can hold on to."